never turning back. Y vamos sin frontera, siempre sin frontera, siempre sin frontera, sin volver atrás, sin volver atrás. Gonna reunite the family, reunite the family, reunite the family, never turning back, never turning back. Familias reunidas, siempre reunidas, siempre reunidas, sin volver atrás, sin volver atrás. Gonna keep on moving forward, keep on moving forward, keep on moving forward, never turning back, 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 never turning back.
Peace.
We love you.
They came with flags and guns, convinced of his election. Rage-filled and dangerous, a ragtag insurrection. They moved with impunity, thinking they'd make history. Hate unveiled blatantly on a day in January. Gathered on that public line, red hats, white-fisted hands, to carry out what he had planned. The guards could not withstand the surging wave of violence through the holes in the balcony. The terror and the treachery of a day in January. Not in our house, not in this country, this land of Rosa, Emma, Cesar, Martin, John. Not with our lives, you won't divide us. We're born of leaders and their spirits carry on. The country froze in the camera's glare. Saw for ourselves what had always been there. We did not fall, not on that day. Now the countdown soon to be a moment for the world to see. Power transferred peacefully to those elected rightfully. We will watch with hope anew, knowing all there's still to do, to forge a land for me and you from a day reaches out. Love reaches out. Love reaches out. Here by your side, bringing you home. Love reaches out. Through the pain your eyes have seen, through the voices in your head, through the war you still endure, love reaches out. To the man who asks for
Hello, friends. It's great to see you all on this beautiful sunny day. Thank you. Thank you for showing up. Despite the weather, we're delighted to see you all here. Our speaker is on her way, Ubering here, so we will get started as soon as she arrives, and until then, continue talking amongst yourselves.
Keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Amaremos con pasión. Siempre con pasión. Siempre con pasión, sin volver atrás, sin volver atrás. Gonna reach across our border, reach across our border, reach across our border. Never turning back.
Protestant lineage of Christian congregations. However, more than a century ago, we decided to build our religious community on how we respect and treat each other, rather than on uniformity of belief. And as a non-creedal religious community, we honor religious wisdom and spiritual truth wherever we find it, in the great religious traditions of the world, in nature, in science, in our hearts, and in democratic values. Democracy is one of our 8 principles, our 5th, which calls us to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the democratic process within our congregations and in our community at large. This principle represents our commitment to one voice, one vote, which is central to any democratic institution, including ours. It also reflects a deeper belief that we're all created equal and possess unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our 5th principle is how we live into our first principle, which calls us to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Now, while it may seem unusual for a religious body to include a commitment to a political method in its defining principles, democracy is more than a mechanism of governance. It is, as Reverend Bill Sinkford puts it, an act of faith, not faith that any one point of view will prevail, but faith that the will of the people will point us toward the beloved community. So democracy demands more than simple majoritarianism. It requires voting, respect for election results, protection of liberties, and the guaranteeing of the right of conscience and free assembly and discussion. We must remain vigilant to prevent any usurpation of individual liberty by the majority. So it is in this context we welcome to Cedar Lane former Senator Russ Feingold and Dean Franita Tolson, who will discuss the future of the right to vote and the challenges our democratic processes face in her 2024 Kiplinger lecture, A Promise Unfulfilled, The Future of the Right to Vote. A word about the Kiplinger lecture. The Kiplinger Lecture on Ethics in American Society, now in its 23rd year, aims to promote a deeper understanding of ethics and morality and to encourage individuals to apply that understanding in their lives. And this lecture is made possible by a generous gift from the Kiplinger Foundation in memory of Mr. Willard M. Kiplinger. Willard Kiplinger was a journalist, editor, and author known for writing about the effects of national government on the economy. He founded the Kiplinger Publishing Company, which originated the Kiplinger Letter and Magazine. He was an active Unitarian throughout his life and a founding member and key supporter of this congregation. His philanthropic activities included supporting educational television and WETA in its early stages. His son Austin continued this culture of philanthropy and honored his father by establishing the endowment grant for an annual program on ethics at Cedar Lane. We welcome Mr. Kiplinger's grandson, Knight Kiplinger, who is with us in person today. Welcome. On behalf of the Cedar Lane community, we are grateful for your generosity that makes this lecture possible. I want to recognize the members of the Kiplinger lecture team who have worked so hard for over a year to organize this year's lecture. Kathleen Nepper, the chair of the team, Peggy Jackson, Coral Mumby, Paul Richter, Peter Henderson, Sandy Shaw, Peter Fenn, and former members Adrian O'Neill and Matt Eliseo. And, oh, I'm sorry, I missed someone. Oh, yes, Diana Adams. Let's give a special round of applause for Diana. And today you will witness not only the fruits of their labor, but also the delectable treats that they have gathered for you all to enjoy after the lecture. It is now my pleasure to welcome Kathleen Nepper to introduce former Senator Russ Feingold.
Good evening, or afternoon, maybe it's still afternoon, I guess it is. We've been planning this literally for over a year, and it's amazing how much effort it takes to put something like this together. And I'm thrilled that you're all here, and I'm thrilled that we have Dean Tolson as our speaker. She actually became the dean of the Gould School of Law at the time, right after we invited her to be the speaker, and she's a scholar in election laws and voting rights, and we were put in touch with her through Russ Feingold, who I, if you believe this, met, somebody would say I stalked, on at the Grosvenor Strathmore metro stop. It's true, it's a true story. I saw this fellow coming down the escalator, and I thought, and I'm from Minnesota. And of course, he was this Wisconsin senator when I was a kid, and he was younger than I was. And I saw him coming down, and he was kind of I was very impressed by him. And I thought, gosh, that guy looks like Russ Feingold. And then I saw him coming down, I thought, nobody can look that much like Russ Feingold and not be Russ Feingold. So I watched as he got on, and I thought, I want to meet this guy. So I watched as he got on one of the cars, and I got on that car, and I walked where he sat down, and I sat down, and I said, aren't you Russ Feingold? And he said, oh yeah, how do you know who I am, blah, blah, blah. So that's how we got to be friends. And that's really how we're all here. So that was an important event in my life. And I thank you all for coming. And I'm talking a little bit so that Franita can sort of relax, because she came in a little bit closer to the time we started than might have been expected. So hopefully she has had a chance to sort of rewind. And I know that Russ and Franita have been meeting and talking about what of value they can offer on this really important topic of voting rights now and in the future, election laws and voting rights, and the ethics involved in that. And I am thrilled to have them here, and I invite them to come up. And I will have cards, if anybody during the course of what they're talking about has questions that they want to ask. This gentleman will pick up your card. You can just hold it up, or if you want a card, just hold up your hand. And through the afternoon, we'll give you an opportunity to write down the questions you have. We anticipate that the talk will be until about a little before 4, and then we expect about a half hour for questions. And then after that, we've got a lot of food, a real lot of food. I ordered food from Balducci's, and they said cakes, and they said, well, you can get a half cake. And I thought, well, half cake? Yeah, let's get 3 half cakes. Wait till you see what a half cake from Balducci's looks like. So, all right.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. This Kiplinger lecture is focused on, as we said, election law and voting rights. And I would argue that calling it timely doesn't quite capture it. The lecture is, as the Reverend said, the Kiplinger Lecture on Ethics in American Society. And it's titled A Promise Unfulfilled, The Future of the Right to Vote. I want to thank this church, Cedar Lane, Reverend Abi, who is such a lovely man, and we got a chance to have lunch with Kathleen about a week ago and found out that he was once in the pulpit right near my home in Madison, Wisconsin, at the Universalist Unitarian Church there, where my little girls, who are now 44 and 41, used to play in the play yard there, called the Whale Yard, designed by one Frank Lloyd Wright, who designed the church. You know, Wright's I would argue, the most famous person from Wisconsin ever. So it is fun to make that connection and brings back very nice memories. And I know from Kathleen that you have such a wonderful congregation here. Of course, I want to thank the Kiplinger family and Mr. Kiplinger for being here and for this lecture series. This is a great thing to do, especially at a time when people need more, not less, discourse of this kind. And of course, I want to thank Kathleen Nepper, who, yes, we did meet that way. We were both out this way looking around for grandchildren that we have around these neighborhoods. And she has been a great supporter of mine when I was in politics, and is incredibly generous to a number of causes, including my organization, the American Constitution Society, and she's just incredibly busy. I can't believe how many things you do. So thank you for getting us involved in this. Of course, I want to thank the Dean for coming all the way across the country for this event. The reason I know her is not only because of obviously her scholarship, but she is a member of the board of our American Constitution Society, and I think she was even on the committee when they hired me. I don't know. Maybe she even voted for me. I don't know. It's possible. But I am very happy that you're here. And she asked that it be a short introduction. It could be a very long one, but we won't do that. We'll just do what she asked. She is the Dean and Carl Mason Franklin Chair in Law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. She's the first, I believe, African-American dean of the law school and the second female dean in the history of USC Gould.
Thank you.
Dean Tolson is the co-author of the leading election book, law casebook, The Law of Democracy, and the author of the forthcoming In Congress We Trust, ? Enforcing Voting Rights from the Founding to the Jim Crow Era. She's a nationally recognized expert in election law, and we are, of course, very honored to have her on our board of directors. Thank you so much for coming, Franita.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Well, I feel like as we get into this, Franita, that I should issue one of those warnings you hear on CNN or NPR. What you're going to hear in the next hour or so may be disturbing, or alarming, or downright depressing. A lot of what's happened in the voting rights here, I think the Dean would agree, has been not only unexpected, but incredibly multifaceted. Mm-hmm. You know, just in terms of my experience, obviously I know a little bit about voting, but until a couple of years ago, I heard all kinds of things about voter suppression, of course. That was something that I worried about as a candidate and just as a citizen. But I had never heard in this country of election subversion. This was a whole new can of worms that adds terrible concerns. You know, when we talked about election suppression, it was like, how do we prevent these tactics from preventing people to vote? How do we get people out to vote? But a lot has changed. But I do want to tell you that, as far as I know, the Dean can correct me, but I believe the 15th Amendment to the Constitution is still good law.
Still good law.
Right?
Still exists.
It says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The third of the three incredibly important Reconstruction amendments. And there was a time not too long ago when everybody was on board this. You know, we have some liberals in Wisconsin, but we have some really conservative Republicans. And one of them was a guy named James Sensenbrenner, who I disagreed with on everything. Everything except he took great pride in being the conservative Republican that helped make sure that the Voting Rights Act got reauthorized. That was the Senate and the country that I came into when I came to the United States Senate. Yeah. So things have gone greatly downhill. So let's start off, Dean, with the state of the law in this area, especially since the decision in Shelby County, which you'll obviously will explain, and even more in the last few years. What are you paying special attention to in this area in this election cycle?
So the interesting thing about everything that's happening, and I actually love where you started, Russ, right? Because the Voting Rights Act and sections 4B and 5 in particular were reauthorized in 2006, and that wasn't that long ago. But it feels like a lifetime ago, given everything that has happened since then. So, just so we're all on the same page, the provisions that were reauthorized in 2006 allowed, basically it required certain states, mostly in the South, to pre-clear any changes to their voting laws with the federal government before those laws could go into effect. And many voting rights scholars, including myself, think of this as the most effective and successful civil rights legislation in history, because it fundamentally changed the landscape of the South, the political landscape, when it was first authorized in 1965. So when the Supreme Court invalidated the formula for that provision in 2013, basically we still have preclearance, but no states are covered. Right, because the Supreme Court said that the formula wasn't updated, so we couldn't use it. That decision is really consequential because what it did was it opened the door for a lot of states to make voting harder. What's one notable example is in the wake of this decision, Texas had a very restrictive voter ID law that it put into effect immediately once the Supreme Court struck down the coverage formula and it was no longer required. Since 2013, you've seen a number of states close polling locations. You've seen a number of states impose new voting restrictions, more restrictive voter ID laws, and so on. So things have definitely gotten more difficult. This has only been complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic, where you saw this shift to vote by mail. And for the first time in our country's history, you had people of color using vote by mail in substantially the same numbers as white people, which previously vote by mail was something that mostly older voters that tended to skew more conservative used, although it was a mechanism that is used by a lot of people. So because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we obviously couldn't vote in person in the same numbers as before. So the 2020 election was notable because you did have this shift from largely in-person voting to vote by mail. But of course, in the wake of the 2020 election, you saw more voting restrictions on vote by mail because of course, this is now a mechanism that is used by a lot of people of color. And so essentially in the last decade, we've seen more voting restrictions, and notably, we've seen restrictions that have responded to how voting patterns among people of color have shifted. And the court, the court is interested in this because on one hand, it's almost like they want nothing to do with it, right? So there was a pretty famous Supreme Court decision a few years ago where the court basically said, okay, partisan gerrymandering claims, we don't want to resolve those, right? There's no claim that can be brought under the federal Constitution. But then we had a case more recently where the court seemed to suggest that, okay, yeah, state courts can weigh in on whether or not state legislatures have gerrymandered districts, but we're going to make sure that they are interpreting their state constitutions in a way that we like, right? So essentially the court has become like the world's worst nosy neighbor, right? It's like, we don't want anything to do with this, but we're going to make sure that everything else is going the way we think it should go. In addition, the court has interpreted other provisions of the Voting Rights Act very narrowly. After the Shelby County decision in 2013, voting rights advocates were like, okay, well, this is bad, but at least we still have Section 2, right? Section 2 applies nationwide. You can challenge not only districts that have been gerrymandered on racial grounds, but you can also challenge voting restrictions that regulate, a person's ability to cast a ballot in the first instance as running afoul of the Voting Rights Act if it has the effect of abridging the right to vote on the basis of race. So Section 2 really did remain sort of this powerful tool. But in a recent case, a case called Bronovich, the Supreme Court interpreted that provision very narrowly, right? And it seemed to prioritize in-person voting on election day, right? As long as the state provides that, we're not going to rigorously enforce Section 2 to apply much beyond that. So essentially the court has not been a friend for voting rights. It's been a very complicated relationship, and it makes me quite nervous going into the November election.
Well, let's go back into the voter suppression part a little bit. you know, a little more on how these suppression techniques have evolved. I remember when I was teaching at Stanford Law School, I got a call from a guy who wanted to sit down with me and have a coffee under a palm tree like you guys have down at USC, and he said, I want to talk to you about voter suppression. He was one of these tech billionaire guys.
Okay.
But for some reason, he had amassed a list of 250 different techniques of voter suppression. And of course, we've heard of many of them, you know, saying that people can't be given a piece of pizza when they're waiting in line. In Milwaukee, where some of us are from, moving the polling places 5 miles away from the central city. Some of the things you were talking about, not allowing drop boxes for that are some of the ones that I'm familiar with. What are the ones that are especially being used at this point?
Well, there's a lot of ongoing litigation challenging some of the more recent voter suppression tactics. One notable example that comes to mind is there's litigation currently ongoing in Arizona because Arizona used to have something called a permanent early voting list. And it was quite convenient, like something like 85 to 90% of voters actually used this list. It was a permanent list where they would mail their ballots. And so they changed that. They changed it to where if a voter doesn't cast a ballot within 2 years or 2 election cycles, they're kicked off this list. So essentially it becomes an active permanent voter list. It's not right. Active voter list, yes, not a permanent voter list. And so the reason this is notable is because if you think about the demographic makeup of Arizona, Native Americans in particular, this list really did benefit them because many of them live on reservations, they are fairly remote. So being able to be mailed a ballot and cast a ballot as a part of the permanent early voting list, it got rid of the need for them to try to find a polling place, which could often be 75, 80, 90 miles away. So just things like that. That is an effective voter suppression method, in part because remember in 2000, I think Biden won that state by less than 15,000 votes, right? So when we think about these voter suppression methods, we cannot think about the methods of the past, which you had quite dramatic results, right? So historically, voter suppression might involve something like a literacy test or the poll tax. Things like that had the effect of disenfranchising many African Americans in the South, double digits. We don't have to do that anymore. Because the margins are so close, it is enough to move a polling place and disadvantage a few hundred people, right? That could have a dramatic impact if you do that with a number of polling places in majority minority communities, right? So essentially you have restrictions that don't have to have a huge impact because the partisan makeup of these states is just so closely divided, right? You just have to peel off a few voters. Another reason why this is problematic is because I already mentioned the Brnovich case. So Brnovich is also a case involving 2 voter laws out of Arizona. So one law was an out of precinct ballot policy. So if you try to vote in a precinct where you're not registered, then they won't count it, right? They won't count your provisional ballot. And then the other policy involved ballot harvesting. So they dramatically limited the ability of individuals to give their ballots to one person, and then that one person takes all of the ballots to the relevant drop-off location, right? So the only people who can handle a ballot under this new law had to be a close family member, essentially. These were not laws that had a huge impact, but they did have a racially disproportionate impact, right? But in resolving that case, the Supreme Court pointed out the fact that it didn't have a huge impact overall. So what this meant is that it didn't necessarily matter that it had a racially disproportionate impact, i.e. more people of color were affected by these policies than white voters. For the court, it mattered that it didn't have a huge impact. But given the state of our politics, the fact that it has a racially disproportionate impact is actually the relevant barometer for whether or not these laws are problematic. But I do think that the court is looking for voter suppression tactics like the tactics of the past. Right, so when they think about these issues, they're thinking about laws like the poll tax. They're thinking about laws like literacy tests, where there was this dramatic impact, where we're comfortable saying that, you know what, those laws were racially discriminatory. Here, the court is much more hesitant to do that. They're way more deferential to the states. And so what this means is that the state doesn't even have to have a good reason for having these laws. You would think that if they are adopting laws that dramatically impact certain populations over others, historically they have had to have reasons. Now they don't really have to have reasons. And given where our politics are, that's highly problematic. Russ already mentioned the fact that you can't give people food and water in line. And it seems relatively small ball, but if you think about the fact that in 2020, in some of the primary elections, in Georgia in particular, Georgia has a law like this, people were in line 4, 5, and 6 hours, right? So to say that you can't give somebody water is actually very meaningful, right? It's a way of trying to deter people from waiting in line in the first place. Another law that I think has voter suppression implications is some states have dramatically expanded the ability of poll watchers to police the polls. Poll watchers are something that they're as old as the Republic, right? But this idea that that poll workers can be penalized if they make it difficult for poll watchers to do their job is something that is rooted in voter suppression. During the 2020 election, there were reports by Black and brown voters in particular that they were harassed by people who were watching the polls, right? These individuals had a tendency to accuse them of not being lawful voters and trying to stand in the way of them actually casting a ballot. So the fact that these individuals enjoy greater protection under state law is something that is rooted in voter suppression.
Well, and so much of these tactics are just obviously racially motivated. I think directly running afoul of the 15th Amendment. For a few years there in Wisconsin, when I was still running for office, there was so-called early voting, which was great. People could vote different times instead of, a lot of people think we shouldn't just have one election day. And of course, there was one community that really was thrilled that people could vote on Sunday. And that community, African-American community, people would come to church. And the minister would see me in the audience and go, "We do not endorse candidates," but I noticed that Senator Feingold is here. He would have just done the same thing if my opponent had been there. But he concluded the service, and he concluded the service and said, and now we're all going to gather, we're going to have a piece of cake and have a drink and a little lemonade, and then we're going to all walk to the polling place together. Well, sure enough, they made sure in a number of states that you could not have the voting on a Sunday. And I'll never forget once having a conversation with a fellow senator of mine who came over to me in the Senate and said, "Do you see what they're trying to do when we try to take the souls to the polls?" As ministers would say. And that senator was a guy named Barack Obama who said that to me. So it's very, very troubling. And I want to talk a little more about what you were just getting into. The impact on poll workers, but also election officials. Part of this subversion is election officials, the actual people that have a job as election officials, are under enormous pressure, leading to a lot of them leaving office. A survey from the Brennan Center found 20% of election officials are likely to quit or retire before this year's election. And of course, the same thing goes for the volunteer poll workers. When I went into my polling place and 28 years in a row, I don't know if it was all the same. It seemed like it was the same ladies there all the whole 28 years. They were there doing a great job, making sure everything was straight and narrow and good. Well, they've scared the heck out of these people by bringing in people who seem kind of aggressive. They're trying to intimidate them. And a lot of those older folks who very much enjoy that and know what they're doing no longer want to do that. So our organization, the American Constitution Society, is recruiting poll workers, young law students, others, to go in there and, just be with them. Maybe they feel a little more comfortable if there's somebody with a little legal training there. So what effect do you think these practices will have on this year's election going forward?
I think it'll have a pretty terrifying impact, actually. I shouldn't say terrifying, that just sounds alarmist, but maybe it's okay for us to be a little alarmed.
I think it's okay.
Yeah, these are scary times, in part because, when you think about election officials, they are partisan, but one thing you found, at least in my experience, is that regardless of party affiliation, they just wanted to do a good job. They wanted to run a clean election. Now, of course, these folks are distinct from the Secretary of State, right? That is an elected position. The Department of Elections tends to be under the Secretary of State in most states, but the actual election officials, regardless of partisan affiliation, no one wants to make the news, right? And so their goal was a bit different from state officials who had some oversight over the election apparatus in the state. So the fact that they are resigning, and we have decades of institutional knowledge that are basically stepping away because they can't take the pressure that's put on them by either state officials or even more locally, right? Because people are becoming very aggressive. In fact, there was a story this week about 2 officials in Michigan who were indicted for tampering with election equipment in 2020, right? So we're really headed towards a time where I think the fact that you have those election supervisors who have all of the institutional knowledge retiring, right? They may not have the same partisan intent as the people who are replacing them. You have people, the little old lady who, works the poll every election. She doesn't want to do it anymore because it's not worth it. You might get death threats, right? And who wants to deal with that? So it raises the question of who's replacing them. Yes, great organizations like ACS are trying to put people in place who can be helpful, right? Law students have some understanding of the law, so they would be nice to have in these spaces, but there are other organizations and other entities who are also trying to place people in polls who might not have the same intent. And I think that raises some concerns. It also makes you wonder about what happens after Election Day. Right? We spend so much time talking about the rules and regulation that govern the election process. I think one thing 2020 put in kind of stark reality for us is we also should care about the voting mechanism that takes place on and after Election Day, right? Because now we do have officials whose motivations are uncertain. We did have a lot of challenges post-Election Day in 2020 that many of which were not necessarily credible, but it did sort of raise questions about the trustworthiness of those who handle our voting apparatus after Election Day. And there's always the specter of violence. I think one of the things that we find comfort in when we have individuals who know how elections work and they're just trying to have a clean election is that you don't really worry about it. Now you have to worry about everything. And because of the violence that happened in 2020, if we have uncertain results in the days after Election Day, then will that also lead to violence too? And that's regardless of outcome. And I think there's a high probability of that.
Afraid so. Before we go to sort of move away from the polling place itself to some of the other threats here, just want to go back to what you already explained, but I want to make sure that we have people leave with a clear understanding of what can happen on the Voting Rights Act. If any of you have ever read Robert Cairo's wonderful biography of Lyndon Johnson and the signal achievement of passing the civil rights laws, realize that this was, as you said, the most important law of its kind. Well, what the dean pointed out is that Section 5 was gutted in the Shelby decision, meaning that in those places where traditionally there had been systematic racist voter suppression, that these sort of special requirements there were eliminated, the pre-clearance requirements. So that opened the door, as she said, to all kinds of abuses.
Yeah.
But Section 2, people said, well, at least Section 2 is fine. What's Section 2? Section 2 is the ability to enforce this by people basically being able to enforce these laws everywhere. And so government, the Attorney General of the United States, Attorney General of Maryland can enforce it. Of course, that's Maryland. That's the United States. Not every place is exactly like that. There are other places that have different kinds of Attorney Generals. And sometimes we've had different Attorney Generals in recent memory. And so if they don't want to do it, Section 2 provides what's called a private right of action, meaning you can sue as an individual. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dean.
Everywhere but the 8th Circuit.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. So, 8th Circuit, Kathleen, Minnesota, no, it was actually in Arkansas. I'm not going to blame Kathleen for it. They recently basically ruled, as you were suggesting, oh no, actually this thing might not apply. You may not be able to do it. So without a private right of action, I think it's fair to say it would be almost a total gutting of much of the Voting Rights Act.
So, yes. Let me take a step back, because one thing I also want to emphasize is that Section 2 is not Section 5, before we understand what the 8th Circuit did here. Section 5, the reason it was so effective is because it applied before the law even went into effect, right? So the law is suspended when it's passed, and then the jurisdiction has to go to the Department of Justice and they have to justify the restriction. If minorities are worse off under the new law than they would have been under the status quo, the Department of Justice says no. Now, of course, they can go to the district court in DC and challenge that ruling, but generally speaking, pre-clearance was effective without the need for the extensive litigation that often comes with Section 2. So don't think that Section 2 is a good replacement. These cases take years. Section 2 is important, but it is very resource dependent, right? So the Department of Justice is only going to bring a certain amount of Section 2 cases because it takes so much. And it's also true that Section 2 enforcement depends on the administration. If you get an administration that is not favorable to Voting Rights Act, they're not going to bring a lot of Section 2 cases. And so private litigation under Section 2 is very important for this reason, because it helps, private individuals actually bring cases that the Department of Justice might not be willing to bring. And so essentially the Eighth Circuit has determined that Section 2, and they looked at the entire structure of the Voting Rights Act, and they concluded that there isn't language there that allows private litigants to bring a case. The reason that this is wrong, so it's clearly wrong, right? And I'm saying that in the strongest terms possible, because at the time that Congress reauthorized Section 2 in 1982, they wanted to restore cases where these were Section 2 cases brought by private litigants. Right? And then the House and Senate report said that there would be a private right of action. But the Eighth Circuit determined that there would be no private right of action. And in part what this does is it further limits the ability of Section 2 cases to be brought. So no Section 5, essentially. Then we have Section 2, which is not a good replacement, but at least it's something. And now private litigants can't bring Section 2 cases. And we have to rely on the government. And so that means, of course, Section 2 enforcement is dependent upon popular politics.
Now, really a horrible thinning down of a great piece of legislation. So, as I said, sort of moving from the polling place to the many threats to democracy that we see every time we turn on the TV. Let me go back to the Constitution, and under Article 1, which is the one that gives the powers to Congress, Section 4, it says the time, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. So can you help us understand what this independent state legislature theory is? It's a case called Moore v. Harper, which basically means, let's say the election was great, people weren't harassed, everybody got to vote, everybody agreed that the Supreme Court of the state that thinks one person won, the governor thinks one person won. This doctrine says, no, the legislature can decide on their own, or at least such what they seem to say, who won. Your reaction?
The independent state legislature doctrine. This is a fun one, guys. All right, so I'm gonna borrow your Constitution. So, time, place, and manner shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. The key to understanding this doctrine is the question of what does legislature mean, right? So is it the legislature alone that determines the congressional districts, and then the state court can't weigh in on that, right? Because the state court, of course, is not the legislature. Keep in mind, I've already mentioned the Rucho case. Rucho, Supreme Court says, federal courts are not going to resolve the partisan gerrymandering issue. In North Carolina, under the North Carolina Constitution, the state Supreme Court there, they determined that, hey, the congressional plan for North Carolina violates the state constitution. Essentially, the state Supreme Court in North Carolina is doing exactly what the Supreme Court said should happen, right? You have a state court that is making a determination that the federal court said federal court shouldn't do. Supreme Court doesn't like that. So what happens is the state legislature in North Carolina said, hey, legislature means legislature. You cannot tell us that we cannot gerrymander these districts because, of course, Article 1, Section 4, legislature means legislature. So the Supreme Court, and of course, when we talk about the independent state legislature doctrine, right, it is this question of does legislature mean legislature, but it's also a bigger question of kind of what level of judicial review should apply to how the legislature has drawn these districts, right? So what we're talking about is an extreme version of the doctrine. The legislature can do whatever it wants, and the state Supreme Court, applying the state constitution, cannot tell it otherwise. But there are other paths here that are also variations of this independent state legislature doctrine. One might say that the Supreme Court adopted a very weak version of this doctrine because the Supreme Court basically said, look, state Supreme Courts can weigh in on this issue, but we will determine whether or not the state Supreme Court has engaged in an unreasonable interpretation of state law in determining whether or not the state legislature has gerrymandered these districts. So again, the world's worst nosy neighbor, right? We don't want to decide, so we're going to let the state Supreme Court decide, But then we will decide whether or not the state Supreme Court has interpreted its own state constitution unreasonably. Right. And so it's not the extreme version of the independent state legislature doctrine. The legislature can do whatever it wants. But it is a version that sort of says that the state Supreme Court doesn't have carte blanche in how it determines what its state constitution means as it applies in this context. Right? And the Supreme Court has determined that it is the body that makes that determination.
We'd be so much better off if we had some uniform laws in this country about these elections. And that is clearly what that says can be done.
Yeah.
You would just need a Congress and a president who was willing to do it. So let's throw another one here. What about allowing people on the ballot who've participated in an insurrection? There's a question. I still can't believe we're even talking about this, but people had to argue, as they certainly had the right to do, that under the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, that a person who has done that can be excluded from the ballot in a particular state. But the court unanimously decided in Trump versus Anderson that that would not apply, at least in that case. How unanimous was it really, that decision, and what are the future prospects?
So it was, what, 7-2? I think it was actually more unanimous than
I thought it was unanimous, wasn't it?
Was it? Oh, maybe it was. Okay.
It wasn't good, whatever.
Oh, no. Sotomayor wrote a concurrence. Yeah. You're right. So it's actually an interesting decision because if you think about earlier points about the court having oversight, that is still very much alive in the context of the Section 3 Trump versus Anderson case. So Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has been a provision that hasn't really been used in probably since like the 1870s, 1880s. Like, you know, it wasn't something that was on anybody's mind until post-January 6th. There were a couple other cases where you had members of Congress who had Section 3 challenges post-January 6th. But this was the first case that really dealt with the former president's role in this. So the court, in resolving this case, was faced with this question of, okay, can a state exclude someone who has violated Section 3 from the ballot? So this is a state court that has made this determination. Very important here. And there was also related questions as to whether or not the president was an office holder that Section 3 even applied to. So the court doesn't resolve the question of what Section 3 means in the sense of should it apply to the president. Instead, the court focuses on this question of can state courts make this determination? And the court concludes that state courts cannot determine that someone, a federal office holder, has violated Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Now, state courts can determine, and states, right, they can determine that a state office holder has violated Section 3, but they cannot make that determination with respect to federal elections. Actually, Congress has to pass a statute. Now, remember what I told you about the court being the world's worst nosy neighbor. So think about what it means when we say that Congress has to pass a statute. If Congress passes a statute under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, there's a case from about 25 years ago where the court said that we determine congressional power under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. So the court isn't saying that we have to decide whether or not Section 3 is violated. Congress can decide, but we determine whether or not Congress has passed a statute that is within our contemplation of what the 14th Amendment means. So even in this context, the court has given itself the power to make the final determination.
All right, on to another depressing prospect, potentially. So, you know, we know the election is going to be in early November, and we also know that a few times in our lifetimes, it didn't end there. I listened to NPR today, had an hour-long thing about Bush v. Gore and everything that happened afterward.
Good times.
Yeah, it was really good time. And then, you know, of course, what happened last time. But now we have a situation where you have third-party candidates. Again, I can't believe I'm referring to Robert F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy in this context, but my hero. But it's a different Robert F. Kennedy. But, you know, there's all kinds of crazy things that can happen if somehow a third-party candidate gets enough electoral votes to prevent the either candidate from getting 272 electoral votes. It goes to the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. And in the House of Representatives, they vote, but they vote one vote per state. Mm-hmm. So you know what happens there. The outcome would be very clear, and it would not be an outcome that many people might like. It depends on your viewpoint, but I'm guessing that there's some people here that wouldn't like the way that would go. And so this raises the question of the Electoral College itself. The fact that it still exists, and there's even ideas about working around the Electoral College. But just your thoughts on that. It's a big subject.
The Electoral College. You know what annoys me? That we always have this conversation after things go wrong, right? Like everything blows up, and then we don't talk about it anymore till the next time it blows up. We actually got pretty close in the 1970s with getting rid of the Electoral College. Yeah, and but I think recently it's just our politics are such where it makes it very difficult to come up with a long-term solution. Even the proposal that's the workaround is not something that if it goes into effect, it will almost definitely be challenged. But let me take a step back for a second. Prior to the 2000 election, the last time we had a situation where the popular vote winner lost the election was 1888. But it happened in 2000, it happened in 2016, it could happen this year, right? And so, the fact that we are living in a space where this happened more in the last 20 years than in the 100 years before that should be a red flag. But I think in part, it's just, this is a product of partisan politics. That's why it makes it so difficult to get rid of the Electoral College. And this is why the national, what is it called, the National Vote Compact? Yeah. This is why, they're trying to come up with a system where if a state signs on, their Electoral College vote goes to the person who wins the popular vote nationwide. But it's probably unconstitutional, right? Because the Electoral College is constitutional, right? It is the constitutional mechanism for trying to determine who the president is. And the argument is that the National Popular Vote Initiative undermines that, right? Because it changes the structure of the Constitution. And given the composition of the Supreme Court as it stands, I think that the justices will be favorably predisposed to that particular argument. Because they are usually strong federalism proponents and they are strong textualists. And so they would be predisposed to thinking that this is something that undermines both the text and structure of the Constitution. So if we get to a situation in November where you have the popular vote winner actually lose the election, which is possible because of Robert Kennedy Jr., I think for a few months everybody will be mad and we'll talk about it, and then nothing will happen. And that's unfortunate. But for some reason, we have not been able to have the appetite that we had in the 1970s for getting rid of the Electoral College. There's not enough sustained attention to things when things go wrong. We just move past it too quickly. I don't know if that's a product of the 24-hour news cycle. I don't know if that's a product of the fact that there's so much to pay attention to that people pay attention to nothing, right? That's another way how voter suppression works. Right, if they constantly pass laws and they're changing the laws and people aren't sure what the law is, if you don't know what ID you have to bring to the polls because there was a new law passed, that law was challenged and struck down, and then it was upheld by the Court of Appeals, it goes to the Supreme Court, it's pending, you don't know what's going on, you just don't pay attention at all, right? And so I think the Electoral College and the reason we still have it is a product of all of that. Right? Part of the effectiveness of voter suppression is pulling people's attention in a million different ways. And this is just another context in which that principle also applies. It is undoubted that most people don't like it. Right? The states that benefit from the Electoral College are states that have like 3 people there. Right? I live in California. Right? I would rather live in Wyoming. Right? Because at least I would have some power on the Senate side, and I would rather live in Iowa if I want to have some power in the context of presidential elections. Well, at least Iowa used to be a swing state anyway. But it has such small benefit for most of the people who live in this country, but it's just that our politics are so contentious, it's really hard to get rid of it. Because then, of course, it raises the question of what do you replace it with? And I think there's just a lot of disagreement there as well.
Well, I mean, it's really just incredible that it even exists in a country like ours, that it could be based on the Electoral College. I mean, think about it. The course of history has been completely altered in our lifetimes, with 2 different people becoming president who didn't even win the popular vote. And it's been a frightful result, certainly from my biased point of view. But the dean is right that this used to be doable. Why? Because it wasn't partisan at all. When Senator Birchby of Indiana proposed the elimination of the Electoral College in the 1970s, he got like 380 votes in the House of Representatives for it. couldn't get the votes in the Senate, two-thirds, because some of the Southern senators were concerned that some of their interests with regard to segregation wouldn't be protected. So it didn't go through, but it came close.
Yeah.
And a constitutional amendment should happen. Now, I've written a book about the Constitution being in jeopardy, which is about the risk of a right-wing constitutional convention. But we also point out in the book that there are things that should be changed in our Constitution. We don't have a right to vote in our Constitution. We have a protection against the discrimination against African Americans in the 15th Amendment, but we don't have a general right to vote. And we have an electoral college. And in fact, I like to say that, you know, the founders, the framers did a pretty good job in some ways, but they were very weak on climate change. You know, they didn't get it. Unlike modern constitutions, have environmental provisions. So we have the hardest constitution in the world to amend, by far. And it's really creating a log jam. I know we're running close to the time where we're going to go to questions from the audience. But let me go back to what you were talking about in terms of gerrymandering. You know, people won't just be voting for president.
Right.
They'll be voting for down the ticket. And after years of developments on redistricting and gerrymandering, what are the best tools available to fight back?
So I'm actually going to borrow from you. You talked about the fact that we don't have a right to vote in past, and I actually think that's very important, right? Because if we had a constitutional right to vote explicitly in the Constitution, it could apply to the gerrymandering question. It could apply to the voter suppression question, right? It could apply to all of these. So the way the Constitution is written, it's written in the negative, right? The right to vote shall not be abridged on the basis of sex. The right to vote shall not be abridged on the basis of race. Even Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, a lot of people don't know about that. Actually, the title of this lecture, it was the first title of my book, and I changed it because it was on Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, and you all are looking at me like, what's that? Which is why I did not make it about Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Only my mom would read that. So Section 2, Section 2 of the 14th Amendment allows Congress to reduce a state's delegation in the House if the state abridges or denies the right to vote. It's never been enforced. It's 150 years old, never been enforced. But it's probably the closest that we come to an affirmative right to vote. And that's not saying much because it applies to apportionment, right? The Congress can reduce a delegation if the state abridges or denies the right to vote. That's far different than having an affirmative protection in the Constitution for a right to vote. Because if you have an affirmative protection for the right to vote, that forces the Supreme Court, Congress, anyone who has any power that weighs on this provision to determine what the right means and what it requires. We don't have that now. All they have to do is say, okay, does this particular voting law discriminate on the basis of race? That's far different from saying the right to vote requires that we have early in-person voting. The right to vote requires that people be able to vote absentee, right? Like these are far different questions. Now, the Supreme Court did, in a case called Harper in 1966, determine that there's a right to vote in the 14th Amendment. They read it in the Equal Protection Clause. But it has significantly cut back on that interpretation in the decades since Harper. So having language in the Constitution that protects the right to vote is even different from the Supreme Court saying that one exists, because later iterations of the Supreme Court can just say it's not as robust as we were saying 50 years ago. Right, so we really need that. Now, I do think that if we had that language, it would require courts to be more aggressive about fighting against gerrymandering. Right now, you know, the Supreme Court can basically say, well, you know, it's very difficult for us to come up with a manageable standard to address gerrymandering, right? When we talk about fair outcomes, what baseline do we use? Like, what is a fair outcome? Which is, you know, a legitimate question. But somehow state courts have miraculously figured out what fairness means, right? Even as the Supreme Court tells us that they can't do it. If we had that language in the Constitution, they would be required to do it, right? They would be required to tackle these hard questions as opposed to coming in as a nosy neighbor and trying to tell state courts how to do it, right? So I actually think that's very important because it extends beyond the gerrymandering context to other laws that are currently legal because we don't have affirmative protections for the right to vote. Let me make one other related point. We do have affirmative protections for the right to vote in most state constitutions, 49 out of 50. And we don't really use that. So when we talk about state courts that have weighed in on the gerrymandering question, it's actually not that many. Not as many as you would think, given the language in state constitutions that affirmatively protect the right to vote. You would think that just because we don't have that language in the federal constitution, it's not the end of the world because state constitutions have that language. State courts tend to tie their interpretations of state constitutions to how the Supreme Court has interpreted the federal constitution. And that is a problem we run into, which is why we really need that language in the federal constitution.
What's the one state that doesn't have
Arizona. Yeah.
So before I ask a last question, before we go to general questions, your point about states is really important. So when you vote this year, think about the impact at the state level as well. In Wisconsin, we have suffered from terrible gerrymandering. In fact, that was the basis of one of the Supreme Court cases that has completely gerrymandered the state in a way that didn't even close to represent the majority of the people of the state. We have a Democratic governor, Democratic lieutenant governor, Democratic attorney general, Democratic state treasurer.
And 66% Republican legislature.
Correct. But what changed it? Well, you may have heard there was a big election for a Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin, and she won by 200,000 votes. Man, I would have loved that. I never won by that much. It was because of the Dobbs decision. Well, guess what? Democratic governor, Democratic Supreme Court. That legislature had to accept a new, reasonably fair plan, which we now have in effect for the next 10 years. So that's part of that. And it leads to my last question, sort of to conclude. And I know it'd probably be easier to answer this if you knew if it was 6 months from now. But what is your view of the future of the right to vote? Are you upbeat at all?
So there was a time when I was, one might say I'm hiding in the administration by becoming dean in a big election year, maybe. But there was a time when I was doing this work and I was very disheartened because things have been trending in the wrong direction for me my entire career, right? There's never been a time where we've anytime I get a favorable decision, it's like, oh, look at that, right? Like it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, right? That's kind of the best that I can hope for. But I have a friend who's also an election law scholar, and I mentioned this to him, and I said, why don't we do this? We should just do administrative law, right? That's easy. Now, of course, the Supreme Court's going to decide whether or not Chevron should be a thing, so that's going to go down the toilet too. But at the time, it just seemed like it was a better option. And he reminded me of that Dr. King quote, where Dr. King says, the moral arc of the universe swings toward justice. And he's like, my friend told me, he said, Dr. King never specified how long it takes for it to swing, right? And I've never forgotten that. And so I just remind myself of that anytime I feel overwhelmed by what's going on, right? And it's also a reminder that we have to keep fighting. I think part of the reason we find ourselves in this situation is because we thought that the battles that we fought in the 60s and 70s, and even before then, had been won. When in reality, it was temporary. It's always temporary. After January 6th, one of the things that I was reminded of is that I was watching what was happening at the Capitol, and I said, this really reminds me of the Wilmington insurrection of 1899, right? So, because I do a lot of historical work. And in that election, you had a duly elected government in Wilmington, North Carolina that was overthrown by white supremacists. They took over the government and nothing happened. The federal government didn't intervene. They just, the mayor, the council, everybody was, pushed out. And it reminded me of that. But one of the reasons why I wanted to put it in that context was a reminder that history might not repeat, but it echoes. And as long as we remember that, it is a reminder that we have to continue to fight for voting rights, even when we feel like we've won something.
Well, I feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
Well, with that, thank you, Dean Tolson. It's an honor.
Thank you. Thank you.
And question time.
Before we're going to have a short break to show a video. Before we do that, I would like to give you an opportunity, Russ, to tell the folks that are here what work you're doing and what the ACS hopes to accomplish in its work. And she's on, Franita, Dr.
And then we're going to
Tolson's
do
on the board. And then we're
Q&A?
gonna- Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So the American Constitution Society, have you ever heard of the Federalist Society? Okay. I wish you had heard of the American Constitution Society. We are trying to present a somewhat different view of the law and reality than these folks have in the last 40 years. It's a national organization that was created after Bush v. Gore, because a lot of smart law professors realized, wait a minute, the court might not be as nonpartisan as we thought. And so it was very much an organization for many years that had a more intellectual sort of idea aspect. But over the years, it became also a network throughout the country in over 150 law schools, including USC, 50-some lawyer chapters. We're the main group that has come together in 55 different groups across the country to identify people in communities who we think would be good federal judges and give them to the Biden administration. Well, we did that. We had 400 names ready. Our groups weren't just lawyers. They went to African American groups. They went to Latino groups, LGBTQ, union, others, and sort of said this, not who has a lot of money in the back room here to help this law student, who would you like to see on the bench when you go into court as a lawyer or litigant? So that's the people we proposed. The administration took them, and I'm happy to report that next week the Biden administration will not only reach 200 new judges in the first term, but it is the most diverse set of judges in the history of this country by far. Nearly 70% women, nearly 70% people of color, and it is an important reversal of some of the things that were done the previous 4 years. So that's the kind of work we do. Thank you, Catherine.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions here we can start with. Do you have any thoughts about the role of gerrymandering?
I think you
Yeah,
largely covered.
yeah. So one distinction that I think often gets lost, some gerrymanders are natural, right? Some of them are just a product of where people live. The fact that in many urban communities, it tends to be disproportionately majority minority. So you're going to have some gerrymanders that are natural. When we think about problematic gerrymandering, we tend to think of it as situations in which the outcome is predetermined. And I think that is really the instance in which gerrymandering raises democratic concerns that courts have to be involved in. And this goes back to the 1960s when the court first determined that the failure to reapportion, right, the failure to, district in the first place. You had states that hadn't done any redistricting in 90 years, right? The failure to do that raises significant democratic concerns. So how have we gotten to a place where the manipulation of district lines to predetermine an outcome is something that federal courts feel are beyond their purview, right? It's just breathtaking to me how we've gotten here in such a short time. Yeah.
This one's going to be especially for Russ, although both of you can respond. Given the significant influence of campaign finance on electoral outcomes, what are the ethical implications of our current campaign finance system for voting rights, and how should campaign finance reform be structured if we have it and support more equitable democratic voting processes?
Well, if you believe in the idea of our system of government, you must believe, I would think, that each person's vote should count the same. But when you have a system of unlimited campaign contributions, it's not, as we used to say, one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. It is $1 million, 1 million votes. I said that about 500 times on the floor of the Senate when John McCain and I spent 8 years finally passing McCain-Feingold. And this whole idea of campaign finance reform really has had an interesting history. It didn't begin with us, and it didn't even begin after Watergate, although that was the critical legislation that started to control it. It began back in the Progressive era, when corporations in the Gilded Age had a stranglehold on the economy, And they were about to get a stranglehold on the voting system by spending money directly on elections. The Tillman Act, advocated by, including Fighting Bob LaFollette of Wisconsin, sent over to the president, Teddy Roosevelt. He signed it, a Republican, and it said corporations could not participate in this way in elections. Now, that was the law of the land. And nobody questioned it. Mitch McConnell didn't question it once on the Senate floor the whole time John and I fought for our bill. And we passed our bill. And the Supreme Court upheld McCain-Feingold. And then the Supreme Court decides, in a terrible decision, 5-4 in 2010, Citizens United, decided that, oh, actually, this 1907 law is no good. Corporations, as long as they don't coordinate, with politicians, you can imagine how valid that is. They don't coordinate, they can spend all they want, and this destroyed the whole structure of our system. So you now have a complete fraud. What basically goes on now is a leader in the Senate, either party. They'll send in, the senator goes in to the MGM or whatever in Las Vegas, meets with the owner or whatever. Here's what we're doing in the Senate, blah, 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 leaves the room. Then the campaign people walk in and ask for $10 million, $100 million. It's completely corrupt. And that is the system that we have right now unless something is done about it.
Just to highlight the shift, though, so Citizens United was 2010. The Supreme Court had actually upheld most of McCain-Feingold, 7 years earlier?
Yeah.
And in a decision that was like 800 pages long, that's why I remember it.
I remember it well.
Right, and so the fact that you have that kind of swing in 7 years is pretty remarkable.
One different person on the court.
New Chief Justice.
No, and we need to reform it. Obviously, overturning that decision would be huge, but Congress can pass a law saying you have to actually not coordinate or it's a felony. Congress could require disclosure. Your states and the federal government could provide opportunities for people to contribute and get a tax credit. The House had this in their bill a couple of years ago when it was under Nancy Pelosi, where you actually could contribute, get a $100 credit for contributing. There are lots of things that can be done, but at the moment, it's not good.
This question is, what role do you see for grassroots movements such as the Poor People's Campaign and other community organizations in having fair voting standards?
I think grassroots movements play a huge role. I think in part that explains what happened in Georgia in 2020, right? There were people on the grounds getting people to the polls, right? Making sure that people had the information that they needed in order to register to vote, helping them register. That's why the restrictions post 2020 were so draconian, because what it does is it places limits on grassroots organizations on their ability to help people register to vote and such, right? So grassroots organizations are really one of the last barriers that we have towards, protecting us from complete chaos, because these are the organizations who are actually putting resources into making sure that everyday people understand their rights. They're still helping people vote. They're still helping people register. So I think they have a huge role to play. It can't just be the courts. And I think that has been our inclination for the last 50 years, is to look to the court to fix everything, to solve everything. That was one of the lessons of Bush versus Gore. Because up to that point, presidential elections, yes, it's a national election, but fundamentally it's an election that happens state by state, right? So the idea of the Supreme Court becoming involved in a presidential election is actually a big deal, because each state conducts the presidential election under their rules, right? So really the idea of the Florida Supreme Court saying the recount will happen under these terms makes much more sense in this context, because the presidential election happens state by state. But we are so used to inviting the Supreme Court to resolve every issue that we have every election cycle that it can lead to perverse outcomes. So once we broaden our thinking beyond just the Supreme Court to include grassroots organizations, state courts, state legislatures, even when we start thinking about elections beyond presidential elections, right? School board elections, elections for those who are in the state legislature, right? We have to expand our thinking, and I think incorporating grassroots organizations incorporates that.
Here comes a question from Utah. It says, hello, Republican Theocratic Utah. Oh, hello from Republican Theocratic Utah. We the people vote, But if the state does not like the outcome, they ignore the will of the people and do not recognize the will of the people. Help. Do you know anything about how the people of Utah found themselves in that predicament?
I mean, they did elect Mitt Romney.
They did.
Well, that's part of the live chat, so that's.
So the person raises a good point, though. You do see things like that. I don't know about a Utah example, but there is an example from Florida that comes to mind. So Florida has a process for amending their state constitution that has led to the state constitution being amended a lot. But long story short, they adopted an amendment that re-enfranchised a number of individuals with felony convictions. And it was really a big deal because it had the potential to fundamentally change the political complexion of that state. So what the state legislature did was come in and reinterpret that particular provision. They said, okay, anybody who tries to vote and you have a felony conviction, you have to make sure you have paid all of your fines and fees. Right, so that's not what the state constitutional amendment said, but that is how this law sort of read it. Now, think about the implications of this. Florida has 67 different counties, right? A lot of counties do not have this information computerized. So you literally have to go and try to figure out what you owe. So sometimes it's actually hard to find this information. And so what ended up happening is that a lot of people did not register to vote because they weren't sure if they could. So that is an example of the people voting for something and then the state legislature coming in and completely undermining it. And this is the type of thing that happens all the time.
This is kind of interesting, very current issue. What new implications do advancements in artificial intelligence have for voter suppression? Think about that.
No, I think it makes it easier to peddle misinformation for sure, right? Because people run campaign ads on Facebook and all of these other mediums, and you don't even know if it's the actual person talking who they purport to be. It's been really, really hard to counter misinformation on social media, even when it is the person talking who is just, telling lies. So I can only imagine how we'll be able to police misinformation that comes from AI generated content when most of the time you don't even know it's AI generated. So it just, to me, adds another level to the problem of election misinformation.
Yeah, that's an issue that we covered in our organization's podcast called Broken Law, where we had an expert on to talk about the implications of AI in the law. And what you were just getting at is, a lot of this communication and so on is campaign stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, it should be reported. The former president is under trial because of campaign mm-hmm. laws. And there is really, the expert was like, how are we going to even figure out who's paying for this? What is it? How does it affect the campaign? It really does undermine the campaign finance laws, potentially.
Yeah, for sure.
How can county party officials, what can they do to support voters that experience voter suppression through aggressive election laws such as examples, moving the polls, restricting early voting, mailing ballots in, etc.? So in other words, what efforts can be made to avoid voter suppression?
It's hard because part of it involves electing people who actually care about this issue. But the goal of voter suppression is to prevent that. One thing I can say, and this is very specific, we have to get rid of I'm blanking. Russ, help me. What's the thing in Congress where the filibuster?
Filibuster.
Yes.
I thought probably that's what it was. Yeah.
We have to get rid of the filibuster because a few years ago there were a couple proposed laws that would have addressed some of the things going on in our system. So, for example, H.R. 4 would have reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. We would have had a new pre-clearance formula. And then H.R. 1 made a number of changes to our system, including automatic voter registration, which would go a long way towards addressing some of the issues we have with people being kicked off the voter rolls for a number of issues. We couldn't get past the filibuster, right? So I mean, that's a very specific thing, but it's what comes to mind when we think about, broad systemic change that we need in order to make our elections better.
Yeah, and keep in mind that the Senate can make an exception to the filibuster. The filibuster, first of all, doesn't apply to everything anyway.
Right.
It doesn't apply to the budget, it doesn't apply to fast-track treaties and so on. There's a very good argument that shouldn't offend those who love the filibuster, that when it comes to voting rights, it's so fundamental, it should not require a supermajority.
Right.
And so that John Lewis bill and others should have been passed.
Here's a specific question. How does Article 4, Section 2 apply to uniform voting standards of the Constitution?
Well, that's one.
I guess everybody needs to be reminded of what Article 4,
So that's
Section
the one
2
I
is.
read out, I believe, which, it doesn't require uniform standards, but Congress can choose to do that. Isn't that right?
Oh, the elections clause.
Right. I believe that's what it is.
Yeah. So the elections clause, it doesn't necessarily require uniform standards in the sense that state legislatures set the time, place, and manner of federal elections, but Congress can make or alter those regulations. Congress doesn't have to necessarily alter those regulations with respect to all 50 states, right? They can focus on a specific state, so it doesn't have to be uniform in that sense. Now, Congress can pass a federal law pursuant to the elections clause that applies to all 50 states. So the National Voter Registration Act, the Motor Voter Law, is an example of that. It's passed pursuant to the elections clause, and it requires states to have, when you get your license, you can also register to vote, right? So the possibility of uniform standards exists, but it's not required.
Here's a question that asks, in a sense, what long-term positive response can people of African Americans experience, because in Louisiana, the court affirmed that there should be two African Americans with African American constituents, and that was constitutionally required. What hope is there in that result? In essence, is the question.
Not much. I think that's an example of winning the battle but potentially losing the war. So the Louisiana case, the court stayed a lower court decision that invalidated a congressional map that drew two majority-minority districts. The reason that this decision is kind of messy because there was a prior federal court decision that invalidated a map that only had one congressional district. So by staying the decision, the Supreme Court allowed November elections to happen under the map with two districts. So that actually looks good for minority voters. But they're going to come in later and determine whether or not that map is constitutional, and they're probably going to strike it down, right? So it's an example of winning today but probably losing tomorrow. And let me make one other point. There's a principle that the court applies called the Purcell principle. And so that principle basically cautions against federal judicial intervention as you get closer to an election cycle, right? So they're more likely to adhere to the status quo. This is why they stayed the decision, right? Because the argument is that we're getting closer to the election, we have to have clarity, and so this is the map that exists. Let's go with this map. It just so happens this is a map that's favorable to minorities. More often than not, these maps are not favorable to minorities. There are two other cases where the court applied this principle inconsistently and it actually hurt minority groups, right? So, it's a good decision today, but it's probably catastrophic later.
I can't really read this, the writing. Should blue states consider empowering an independent commission to draw, I guess it says congressional
District?
Yeah, I guess that's what it is.
Well, I think any state should at least think about it. I grew up in a state we believed in elections. We believed in electing our judges. We believed in, the democratic process. But it got so corrupted by gerrymandering that people who would not have supported independent commissions, whether in a blue state or a red state, there would be, I think Iowa does this, I think other states, I think it would be at least worth considering.
Yeah, no, I think, generally speaking, I think the outcome with using independent commissions has been generally favorable. It's generated quite a bit of litigation in part because state legislatures, of course, have fought against the delegation of authority to these independent commissions. So in fact, the first time we really talked about this question in the context of the elections clause of whether legislature means legislature actually came up in the context of a case where Arizona had, the voters there adopted an independent commission to draw their congressional districts. The state legislature fought it because they're like, legislature means legislature. You cannot give this power to an independent commission. The Supreme Court in that case actually sided with the voters, right, and found that you can give this authority to an independent commission. So it was one of those cases in my career like, okay, not so bad, right? So I do think it's a way of trying to generate districts that aren't so partisan, and I think they can have good effects.
It is now 4:30, and do you have something, Russ?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for doing this, particularly Dean Tolson and Kathleen and everybody. And I think it's time to adjourn to these very large cakes that we're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dean Tolson and Mr. Feingold, thank you so much for your thought-provoking and sometimes depressing remarks and highlighting the importance of both the future of our right to vote and implications of campaign finance reform. And your insights and your expertise really has not only deepened our understanding, but also highlighted the urgency for us to be engaged in this. So thank you for all that you brought and shared with us. And before we close, I would also like to thank everyone who helped with today's lecture, to Kathleen Nepper and the Kiplinger lecture team, the Cedar Lane staff, Mike Morse, Peter Mathers, and Michael McCrickard, our AV team, and Senator Feingold's staff, who really helped all of us in not only promoting this event, but also getting people here. So thank you. Thank you. Yes, but you are not allowed to leave until we watch Emma's Revolution. So let us close with some song.
They came with flags and guns, convinced of his election. Rage-filled and dangerous, a ragtag insurrection. They moved with impunity, thinking they'd make history. Hate unveiled blatantly on a day in January. Gathered on that public land, red hats, white-fisted hands, to carry out what he had planned. The guards could not withstand the surging wave of violence through the holes in the balcony. The terror and the treachery of the day. They came with flags and guns, convinced of his action. Rage-filled and dangerous, a ragtag insurrection. Moved with impunity, thinking they'd make history. Hate unveiled blatantly on a day. January, and their spirit carried on. Gathered on that public land.
Thank you again, and let's go and have some refreshments.
We do not our people gonna see. Not on everything, in spite of everything. Hear our freedom ring, our people gonna see. Now we count down soon.
Our people gonna fight. Our people gonna fight. The world we know.